If hard work alone created wealth, millions of hard-working people would already be financially free. But that's not the world we see. All around us are people who wake up early, work long hours, and carry enormous responsibility. Yet they still feel constant financial pressure. At the same time, there are families who seem to build stability generation after generation. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. And when historians and economists study long-term patterns of wealth, one culture often appears again and again in that conversation: the Jewish community. Now, this is not about stereotypes or myths, and it certainly doesn't mean every individual follows the same path. But across centuries of history, Jewish families have consistently produced remarkable numbers of thinkers, entrepreneurs, financiers, scientists, and innovators. From merchants traveling across medieval trade routes, to banking families in Europe, to modern entrepreneurs, investors, and intellectual leaders around the world. How does such a small community repeatedly produce such a strong relationship with knowledge, business, and financial resilience? The answer is not a secret formula. It's something far more powerful. Principles. Principles passed down through families. Principles discussed at dinner tables. Principles reinforced through education, culture, and tradition. Instead of teaching children how to get rich quickly, many Jewish traditions emphasize something much deeper: how to build stability that can last longer than one lifetime. And that shift in thinking changes everything. Because when you focus only on quick money, your decisions become short-term. You chase trends, you chase excitement, you chase opportunities that promise fast rewards. But when you think in decades, or even generations, your priorities start to change. You begin to focus on education. You begin to focus on protecting capital. You begin to focus on ownership instead of constant labor. You begin to understand that wealth is rarely built through dramatic moments. It is built through small principles, repeated over very long periods of time. One ancient passage from the Talmud offers a surprisingly modern piece of financial wisdom. It suggests that a person should divide their wealth into 3 parts. 1 part invested in land, 1 part invested in business, and 1 part kept in reserve. In other words, diversify, build assets, and protect liquidity. This advice was written nearly 2,000 years ago, and yet it sounds strikingly similar to the core principles taught by modern financial planners today. Personally, one of the most fascinating things about studying wealth across different cultures is this: the people who build the most durable financial lives are rarely the loudest ones. They are rarely the ones constantly talking about money. They are rarely the ones chasing attention. Instead, they are the ones quietly focusing on learning, investing, protecting their capital, and making disciplined decisions year after year. In many ways, the real power of financial wisdom is not how exciting it sounds, it's how consistent it is. In this audiobook, we're going to explore 8 powerful financial principles often associated with Jewish wisdom about money. These ideas are not investment tricks. They are not get-rich-quick strategies. They are ways of thinking, ways of understanding how money, knowledge, and time interact with each other. And the most important thing to remember is this: you don't need to be born into any particular culture to learn these principles. Financial wisdom is not inherited by blood. It is inherited by understanding. Sometimes, discovering just one principle at the right moment can completely change how you approach money for the rest of your life. So, if you've ever wondered why some families quietly build wealth over generations while others remain trapped in constant financial stress, this conversation may help you see money in a very different way. And it begins with a surprisingly simple idea, one that challenges much of what modern society teaches about success: the idea that money itself is not the goal. It is only a tool. And understanding that difference is where real wealth often begins. Chapter 1. The Jewish View of Money. A tool, not a god. One of the most surprising ideas in traditional Jewish financial thinking is also one of the simplest. Money is important, but it is never meant to become the center of life. In many Jewish teachings, money is viewed as a tool, something useful, powerful, and necessary, but never something to worship. That distinction may sound subtle, but it changes the way people make financial decisions. Because the moment money becomes a goal by itself, something interesting begins to happen. People start chasing it endlessly. They take bigger risks. They compare themselves constantly. And often, the pursuit of wealth slowly begins to replace the purpose of living. Many ancient Jewish teachings warn about this exact danger. Not because money is bad, but because the human mind is incredibly good at turning useful tools into unhealthy obsessions. The Talmud, a central text of Jewish scholarship and philosophy, often approaches money in a surprisingly balanced way. It acknowledges that financial stability is important. Families need security, communities need resources. Education, charity, and opportunity often depend on financial strength. But it also reminds people that wealth must always remain in service of life, not the other way around. In other words, money is meant to support your values. It is not meant to replace them. And when you look at the financial habits of many successful Jewish families throughout history, you can see how deeply this mindset is embedded. Instead of treating money as a symbol of status, they often treat it as a resource to manage carefully. And instead of chasing luxury immediately, they prioritize stability. Instead of measuring success through possessions, they measure it through security, education, and long-term opportunity. This way of thinking has shaped generations of financial behavior, and in many ways, it protects people from one of the most common financial traps in modern society: the trap of confusing income with wealth. Today, many people associate financial success with visible signals: a larger house, a newer car, more expensive vacations. But these signals often represent spending power, not actual wealth. In fact, some of the most financially stressed households in the world also have some of the highest visible lifestyles. Because maintaining those lifestyles requires continuous income, the moment income stops, the entire system collapses. True financial stability works differently. It is often much quieter, it grows slowly, and it focuses on resilience instead of appearance. Personally, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from studying different wealth cultures is that people who build long-term financial stability rarely treat money emotionally. They treat it strategically. They understand that money can amplify life, but it cannot define it. And this mindset creates a kind of calm financial discipline. When money is only a tool, you are less likely to panic during market downturns. You are less likely to chase risky trends. You are less likely to measure your worth through comparison. Instead, you begin to focus on what money is actually supposed to do: provide security, create opportunity, support family, fund education, enable freedom, and perhaps most importantly, give you the ability to make decisions based on values instead of desperation. Another fascinating aspect of Jewish financial thinking is the strong cultural emphasis on balance. There is a well-known teaching suggesting that a person should divide their resources carefully between living, investing, and giving. In many Jewish communities, the practice of charity, known as tzedakah, is not viewed as optional generosity. It is considered a responsibility. The idea behind this is powerful. Money should circulate. It should strengthen families, communities, and future opportunities. When wealth only flows in one direction, toward accumulation, it often creates instability and inequality. But when wealth flows through education, business, and community support, it tends to multiply. This philosophy also reinforces something deeply practical. Money is temporary. Knowledge lasts longer. Character lasts even longer. And when financial decisions are guided by those deeper priorities, wealth becomes much more durable. Think about it this way. If someone builds their life around showing wealth, they will always feel pressure to maintain that image. But if someone builds their life around stability, education, and long-term thinking, the pressure becomes much smaller. They don't need to prove anything. They only need to keep following the principles that work. And this may be one of the quiet secrets behind many financially resilient cultures. They don't obsess over money. They simply treat it correctly. As a tool, a powerful one, yes, but still just a tool. And once you understand that idea deeply, something interesting begins to happen. Money stops controlling your decisions. Instead, you begin controlling what money does in your life. And that shift in perspective opens the door to the next principle. Because once money is placed in the right position, as a tool rather than a goal, the next question becomes clear. If money is not the ultimate goal, then what is the most valuable investment a person can make? For many Jewish families throughout history, the answer has always been the same: education. And that principle changes the entire financial journey. Chapter 2. Education is the real inheritance. If money is only a tool, then the next logical question becomes clear. What is the most valuable asset a person can possess? For many Jewish families throughout history, the answer has never been complicated. Education. Not just formal education, but intellectual development, critical thinking, and a lifelong respect for learning. In fact, one of the most consistent cultural traits across Jewish communities around the world is the extraordinary emphasis placed on knowledge. Parents often repeat a simple idea to their children: if someone takes your money, you can earn it again. But if you lose your knowledge, you lose something far more difficult to rebuild. This philosophy has shaped generations of behavior. Long before modern economies began rewarding innovation and intellectual work, a Jewish culture already treated knowledge as the most reliable form of wealth. And historically, there was a practical reason for this. For centuries, Jewish communities often lived under restrictions that limited what they could own. In many parts of Europe and the Middle East, Jews were not allowed to own land. In some regions, they were excluded from certain professions. Under those conditions, physical wealth was fragile. Property could be taken. Businesses could be confiscated. But knowledge could not be taken away so easily. Education became a form of portable wealth, something a person could carry anywhere, something that could not be stolen by politics, war, or economic change. Over time, this survival strategy evolved into a cultural value. Learning was no longer just practical. It became honorable. To study became a daily discipline. Debate became part of intellectual life. In traditional Jewish education, students are encouraged to question, challenge, and analyze ideas deeply. In fact, if you observe a traditional Talmud study session, it rarely looks like passive learning. Students argue, they challenge interpretations, they explore multiple perspectives. The goal is not simply to memorize answers. The goal is to develop the ability to think. And this habit of intellectual curiosity carries enormous advantages in the modern world. Because today's economy rewards something very specific: problem solving, innovation, strategic thinking, skills that emerge naturally from a culture that values questioning and discussion. And this helps explain why Jewish individuals have historically appeared in high numbers across fields such as science, medicine, law, finance, entrepreneurship. These professions rely heavily on knowledge, analysis, and decision-making. And while talent certainly plays a role, cultural priorities matter just as much. When children grow up seeing books, discussions, and learning treated as essential parts of life, they internalize the idea that knowledge is powerful. Personally, one of the most interesting things about studying wealth cultures is noticing how often financial stability begins with intellectual discipline. Not speculation, not luck, but learning. People who commit to learning consistently often develop a long-term advantage. They recognize opportunities earlier. They understand risk better. And they make more informed decisions over time. In contrast, many financial mistakes are not caused by a lack of effort. They are caused by a lack of understanding. People invest in things they do not understand. They follow trends they cannot explain. They take risks they cannot properly evaluate. Education changes that. Not because it guarantees success, but because it improves the quality of decisions. And over decades, the quality of your decisions shapes the quality of your financial life. There is another interesting dimension to this philosophy as well. In many Jewish families, education is viewed not only as personal advancement, but also as a form of responsibility. Parents invest heavily in their children's learning. Communities support schools and scholarship. Now, an intellectual achievement is often celebrated just as much as financial success. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Each generation becomes slightly more knowledgeable than the previous one, and that accumulated knowledge compounds over time, much like financial investments. In fact, if you think about it carefully, knowledge behaves very similarly to money. It compounds. What you learn today makes it easier to learn something more complex tomorrow. Skills build upon other skills. Ideas connect to other ideas. And over decades, the intellectual capital of a family or community can become incredibly powerful. This is one reason many Jewish traditions emphasize studying sacred texts throughout life. Not just during childhood. Lifelong learning keeps the mind active and adaptable. And adaptability is one of the most valuable assets in an unpredictable economy. Because the world changes constantly. Industries rise and fall. Technologies disrupt entire markets. But people who continue learning can evolve alongside those changes. And that ability to adapt often becomes a hidden form of financial security. One generation may build wealth through trade, another through science, another through technology. The specific industries may change, but the underlying asset remains the same. Knowledge. In the long run, knowledge tends to outlast money. And that idea leads directly to another important financial principle. Because once a person values education deeply, they begin to see the world differently. They begin to understand something fundamental about how wealth is actually created, not through effort alone, but through value. And that brings us to the next principle. The principle that explains why some work is rewarded far more than other work, and why understanding value may be one of the most important financial lessons anyone can learn. Chapter 3. Wealth comes from value, not effort. Alone. One of the most common beliefs about money is also one of the most misleading. Many people grow up believing that wealth is primarily the reward for hard work. Work longer hours, push harder, stay busy. And eventually, the financial rewards will follow. At first glance, this idea seems reasonable. Effort clearly matters. Discipline matters. Persistence matters. But if effort alone created wealth, then some of the hardest working people in the world would already be financially secure. Construction workers, farmers, factory workers, nurses, and countless others often work incredibly demanding jobs. Yet many of them still struggle financially. Meanwhile, there are people who work fewer hours but earn dramatically higher incomes. So what explains this difference? The answer lies in a simple but powerful concept. Markets reward value, not effort. In other words, money flows toward the people who solve important problems, create useful systems, or produce something that many others need. The effort behind the work is often invisible, but the value created is measurable. Think about the difference between digging a hole in your backyard and performing surgery. Both activities may require hours of concentration and physical effort, but one provides a life-saving service that very few people are trained to deliver. The market values that scarcity and impact, and therefore the compensation reflects that difference. Understanding this principle changes the way a person approaches money. And instead of asking, "How hard can I work?" the better question becomes, "What valuable problems can I solve?" Throughout history, many Jewish communities developed a strong awareness of this principle, partly because they had to. In many regions, Jews were historically restricted from owning farmland or joining certain traditional professions. As a result, they often moved toward fields that relied on knowledge, negotiation, and value creation. Trade, finance, medicine, law, scholarship. These professions reward individuals not simply for effort, but for expertise, insight, and problem solving. Over time, this encouraged a mindset that focuses less on labor and more on value. For example, a merchant does not earn money by working physically harder than everyone else. A merchant earns money by identifying a need and connecting supply to demand. A banker does not earn money through physical effort. A banker earns money by managing capital and assessing risk. A doctor earns money not because the work is easy, but because the knowledge required to perform it is rare and valuable. This focus on value creation gradually shapes financial thinking. Instead of measuring success through hours worked, people begin measuring success through impact created. And this perspective becomes even more powerful in modern economies. Today, technology allows one idea, one product, or one innovation to reach millions of people. A single piece of software can serve customers across the entire world. A book can influence millions of readers. A platform can connect entire markets. In such an environment, so the gap between effort and value becomes even more dramatic. Someone working 80 hours a week on low-value tasks may earn far less than someone who designs a system used by millions. Personally, this was one of the most important mindset shifts I encountered while studying wealth. Early in life, it's easy to believe that financial progress comes mainly from working harder. But over time, it becomes clear that working harder only increases income slightly. Working smarter about value changes everything. When you start thinking about value, your priorities shift. You invest more time in learning useful skills. You pay attention to how markets function. You study what problems people actually need solved. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to recognize opportunities that others overlook. The many successful entrepreneurs follow this exact path. They observe something inefficient or inconvenient in everyday life. Then they ask a simple question: how could this be done better? If the answer solves a real problem for enough people, value is created. And where value exists, money often follows. However, there is another interesting layer to this principle. Creating value does not always mean inventing something entirely new. Sometimes it means improving something slightly. Sometimes it means delivering a service more reliably. Sometimes it means organizing information in a way that helps others make better decisions. Value appears in many forms, but the underlying rule remains the same. The greater the value you create for others, the greater the potential reward. This idea also connects back to the previous chapter about education. Because education expands the number of problems you are capable of solving. The more knowledge and skills you acquire, the more valuable contributions you can potentially make. Over decades, this combination of learning and value creation compounds. Skills grow, reputation grows, opportunities expand. And eventually, financial rewards begin to reflect that accumulated value. But understanding value creation leads naturally to another important financial question. Even if someone earns a high income from valuable work, that alone does not guarantee long-term wealth. Because income and wealth are not the same thing. Income is money flowing in. Wealth is what remains after decisions are made. And this is where the next principle becomes critical. Because throughout history, one of the most powerful wealth-building strategies has not been working harder. It has been owning assets that continue producing value over time. And that shift from labor to ownership has shaped the financial strategies of many successful families across generations. Chapter 4. Ownership is the engine of wealth. Once you understand that money flows toward value, another important realization begins to appear. Creating value can generate income, but ownership is what turns income into lasting wealth. This distinction may seem simple at first, yet it represents one of the most important financial shifts a person can make. Most people spend their entire lives operating within one system. They exchange time for money, work a certain number of hours, receive a paycheck, repeat the cycle again next week. There is nothing inherently wrong with this structure. Employment can provide stability, experience, and opportunity. But there is a hidden limitation inside this system. Your income stops when your labor stops. If you take a break, the money stops. If you get sick, the money stops. If the job disappears, the money stops. In other words, labor produces active income, and active income always depends on continuous effort. Ownership works differently. Ownership produces ongoing value. When someone owns a business, a property, or a productive asset, the value can continue even when the owner is not actively working every moment. A shop owner may hire employees. A landlord may collect rent. An investor may earn dividends. A shareholder may benefit from the growth of a company. The key difference is not effort. The key difference is structure. Ownership allows value to continue flowing beyond the hours you personally work. And historically, many Jewish families recognized this distinction early, partly because they had to adapt to unpredictable economic environments. For centuries, Jewish communities often lived under political uncertainty. So businesses could be restricted. Markets could change quickly. Under those conditions, relying entirely on labor could be risky. Instead, families often focused on building and protecting assets, businesses, trade networks, financial partnerships. Over time, these assets created economic resilience. If one opportunity disappeared, another could take its place. Ownership provided flexibility and stability, and this principle remains just as relevant today. Many people focus intensely on increasing their income. Higher salary, better position, more promotions. But income alone rarely creates long-term financial independence, because lifestyle often expands alongside income. Expenses increase, expectations rise, and the financial pressure continues. Ownership changes the equation. When assets begin producing income, the relationship between time and money starts to shift. Instead of working solely to earn money, money itself begins working. This transition rarely happens overnight. Most people begin by saving, then investing, perhaps purchasing their first asset. Maybe shares of a company, maybe a small business, maybe a property. At first, the income generated by these assets may be modest, but over time, something powerful begins to happen. The income streams multiply. One investment leads to another. Dividends are reinvested. Businesses expand. Assets appreciate. Gradually, the foundation of wealth begins to grow. And once again, patience becomes a key factor. Ownership rewards those who think long-term. An investment held for decades can grow dramatically. A business built steadily can become extremely valuable. But the benefits of ownership extend beyond income. Ownership also creates control. Employees depend on decisions made by others. Owners participate in those decisions. They shape direction, they influence strategy, they create systems. Of course, ownership also carries responsibility and risk. Not every investment succeeds. Not every business thrives. Markets fluctuate. Economic cycles change. But over long periods of time, ownership has historically been one of the most reliable engines of wealth. Personally, one of the most striking observations about wealthy families across different cultures is how consistently they prioritize assets over appearances. They are often less concerned with looking rich, and far more concerned with owning things that produce value. This might include businesses that generate revenue, investments that grow steadily, real estate that produces income, or intellectual property that continues earning long after the initial work is done. While others focus on consumption, they focus on ownership. This mindset creates a very different financial trajectory because consumption removes money from the system. Ownership multiplies it. Over decades, this difference becomes enormous. A lifestyle built primarily on spending tends to remain fragile. A lifestyle supported by productive assets becomes stronger over time. And this principle also connects to something deeper within many Jewish financial traditions. Responsibility. Ownership requires discipline. Assets must be managed. Decisions must be thoughtful. Risks must be evaluated. And this discipline often encourages a more thoughtful relationship with money overall. Instead of chasing immediate gratification, owners tend to think about sustainability. Instead of focusing on short-term rewards, they consider long-term outcomes. This mindset not only protects wealth, it often helps create it. But ownership alone does not explain everything, because even the most successful individuals rarely succeed entirely on their own. Behind many great businesses, investments, and opportunities lies something equally powerful: relationships, trust, community. And throughout history, one of the most remarkable strengths of Jewish communities has been their ability to build strong networks of cooperation and support. Those networks have created opportunities that no individual could create alone. And that brings us to the next principle: the power of community. Chapter 5. Community multiplies. Opportunity. There is a common myth about wealth that appears again and again in modern culture. The myth of the self-made individual. The story usually goes something like this. One person works harder than everyone else. One person takes extraordinary risks. One person builds success completely alone. But if you study the history of successful businesses, influential families, and thriving economic communities, a very different pattern emerges. Wealth rarely grows in isolation. It grows inside networks of trust. And throughout history, one of the strongest advantages many Jewish communities developed was precisely this ability to build and maintain strong networks. Community, trust, shared knowledge, mutual support. Now, these elements created economic opportunities that were far larger than what any individual could accomplish alone. To understand why this matters so much, we need to look briefly at history. For centuries, Jewish populations lived scattered across different countries and regions. Trade routes connected cities across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Jewish merchants often operated within these networks, exchanging goods, information, and financial resources across great distances. Because they shared language, cultural traditions, and trust within their communities, they could cooperate more easily than strangers in unfamiliar markets. This network created something incredibly powerful. Information traveled faster, opportunities appeared earlier, partnerships formed more easily, and risk could be shared. Yet imagine two merchants operating in distant cities hundreds of years ago. If they had no relationship or trust between them, doing business together would be extremely risky. But within established community networks, trust could be built through reputation and shared connections. That trust reduced friction in trade. And whenever friction disappears, economic activity tends to expand. In many ways, this early form of economic networking resembles what we see today in modern business ecosystems. Entrepreneurs collaborate, investors share opportunities, professionals exchange knowledge. Entire industries often grow through communities rather than individuals. Silicon Valley is a famous modern example. Startups succeed not only because of brilliant founders, but because they exist within a network of engineers, investors, advisors, and mentors who constantly exchange ideas. When people share knowledge and opportunity, the entire system becomes more innovative. And the same principle has existed in Jewish communities for generations. Families supported each other's businesses. Communities helped new entrepreneurs start their first ventures. Young people entering professions often benefited from mentorship and connections. These support systems did not guarantee success, but they dramatically increased the number of opportunities available. Personally, I find this principle incredibly important in today's world. Modern culture often celebrates independence so strongly that people forget how powerful cooperation can be. We are taught to compete, to outperform others, to win individually. But many of the most successful people in business understand something different. Relationships often create opportunities that effort alone cannot produce. Think about how many careers change because of one conversation, one introduction, one recommendation, one partnership. These moments rarely appear in isolation. They grow from trust built over time. And trust is one of the most valuable currencies in any economy. Money can be lost, markets can collapse, industries can change. But a strong network of trusted relationships can create new opportunities again and again. This is why many successful professionals invest significant time in maintaining relationships. Not in a manipulative way, but in a genuine way. Helping others, sharing ideas, supporting community initiatives, offering mentorship. Over time, these actions build a reputation, and reputation becomes a form of economic capital. When people trust you, they want to work with you. When they want to work with you, opportunities appear more often. Another fascinating element within many Jewish traditions is the cultural importance of community institutions. Schools, synagogues, charitable organizations, educational networks. These institutions create spaces where people meet, exchange ideas, and build relationships. They also reinforce shared values around education, responsibility, and mutual support. In economic terms, these institutions strengthen what economists sometimes call social capital. Social capital refers to the trust, cooperation, and shared norms that make collective action easier. And societies with strong social capital often experience stronger economic growth, because people are more willing to collaborate, invest together, and share opportunities. In contrast, environments with low trust tend to become fragmented. Partnerships become harder. Transactions become more expensive. Opportunities become limited. This is one reason why communities built around trust can outperform much larger populations that lack cooperation. Of course, community support does not remove the need for personal responsibility. Every individual must still develop skills, discipline, and character. But when those qualities exist inside a supportive network, the impact becomes much greater. Opportunities multiply. Knowledge spreads faster, and success becomes easier to sustain across generations. But even with strong communities and valuable networks, one challenge remains. Financial success can still disappear if it is not protected. Many people work hard, earn well, and build strong relationships. Yet they still lose wealth through poor financial decisions, risky investments, excessive debt, emotional reactions during economic uncertainty. This is why another important principle appears repeatedly in Jewish financial thinking, a principle that may sound simple, but is surprisingly difficult to practice. Protect your capital before chasing profit. Because in the long journey of wealth building, avoiding catastrophic losses often matters more than chasing spectacular gains. Chapter 6. Protect capital before chasing profit. In the world of investing and wealth building, there is a lesson that often arrives too late. Most people learn it only after experiencing a painful financial loss. The lesson is simple, but its consequences are enormous. Protect your capital before chasing profit. At first glance, this idea might sound conservative, even cautious. In a world filled with stories about bold risk-taking and overnight success, protecting capital does not sound exciting. But historically, some of the most financially resilient cultures have built their wealth around this exact principle. And within many Jewish financial traditions, the preservation of capital has long been treated as a fundamental rule. Because once you understand how wealth actually grows over time, the logic becomes clear. Wealth compounds slowly. Losses destroy progress quickly. Imagine someone who invests and grows their money by 10% each year. Over time, that steady growth can become very powerful. But if that same person experiences a single large loss, perhaps 50% of their capital, the recovery becomes extremely difficult. A loss of half your money does not require a 50% gain to recover. It requires 100% growth just to return to the starting point. This mathematical reality is why many experienced investors spend far more time thinking about risk than about profit. They ask questions like, what could go wrong? What is the worst-case scenario? How much capital could be lost? These questions are not signs of fear. They are signs of discipline. Because protecting capital allows the power of compounding to continue working over long periods of time. This mindset appears repeatedly in Jewish financial history. In uncertain political environments, communities often had to be extremely careful with how they managed money. Investments were considered carefully. Partnerships were evaluated through trust and reputation. And diversification was often encouraged. In fact, one famous teaching from the Talmud suggests that a person should divide their wealth into 3 parts: 1/3 in land, 1/3 in business, and 1/3 kept in reserve. This ancient advice reflects a remarkably modern concept: diversification. By spreading resources across different forms of assets, individuals reduce the risk of losing everything if one investment fails. Today, financial advisors teach very similar principles. Diversify investments. Avoid concentrating too much risk in a single opportunity. Maintain liquidity for unexpected situations. But even with this knowledge widely available, many people still struggle with risk management. Why? Because the psychology of money often pushes people toward the opposite behavior. When markets are rising, people become overconfident. They take larger risks. They believe success will continue indefinitely. When markets fall, fear takes over. Investors panic. They sell at the worst possible moment. These emotional reactions create a cycle that destroys wealth. Buy high, sell low. Repeat. Protecting capital requires resisting this emotional cycle. It requires patience, discipline, and sometimes the willingness to accept slower growth in exchange for greater stability. Personally, I believe this is one of the most underestimated aspects of financial wisdom. People spend enormous time searching for investments that might double their money quickly. But they rarely spend the same amount of time asking how to avoid catastrophic mistakes. And in many cases, avoiding one major mistake can protect years of progress. This principle is especially important in modern financial environments filled with hype and speculation. Every year, new investment trends appear. Cryptocurrencies, high-growth startups, speculative trading strategies. Some of these opportunities may eventually succeed, but many disappear just as quickly as they appear. And investors who chase every trend often experience large losses along the way. Experienced investors tend to behave differently. They move more slowly. They analyze carefully. They understand that wealth is rarely built through dramatic bets. Instead, it grows through consistent decisions made over decades. Another aspect of capital protection involves something less obvious: lifestyle decisions. Many people increase their spending dramatically as soon as their income rises. A larger house, more expensive cars, more luxurious habits. At first, these upgrades feel rewarding, but they also increase financial vulnerability because high expenses require continuous high income. If income stops, financial stress appears quickly. Protecting capital sometimes means resisting the pressure to expand lifestyle too quickly. It means building a financial buffer, saving, investing, maintaining flexibility. In uncertain times, that flexibility becomes extremely valuable. Economic downturns come and go, industries evolve, unexpected challenges appear. People who maintain reserves and protect capital can adapt. They survive difficult periods and continue building wealth afterward. Those who operate with no margin often struggle when conditions change. And throughout history, communities that survived long periods of economic uncertainty developed a deep appreciation for resilience. Resilience does not come from taking the biggest risks. It comes from surviving long enough for opportunity to return. Because in the long run, financial success is often less about dramatic victories and more about avoiding devastating defeats. If you protect your capital, time becomes your ally. Compounding continues working. Opportunities appear again, and progress continues. But even this principle leads to another deeper question. If protecting capital is so important, what should wealth ultimately be built for? Is the goal simply to accumulate money for one lifetime? Or is there something more powerful than that? For many Jewish families, the answer has always involved a longer horizon. Not just years, not just decades, but generations. And that long-term perspective introduces the next principle. Chapter 7. Think in generations, not years. One of the most powerful differences between short-term financial thinking and long-term wealth building lies in a single question. How far into the future are you thinking? For many people today, financial planning rarely extends beyond a few immediate concerns. This year's income, next year's expenses, perhaps retirement decades later. But the horizon often remains relatively short. Yet throughout history, some families have approached money with a very different perspective. Instead of asking how much wealth they can accumulate during their own lifetime, they ask something much broader. What kind of foundation are we building for the generations that come after us? This generational mindset has been deeply embedded in many Jewish communities for centuries. Families often think not only about their children's education, but also about the stability of their grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. Financial decisions are evaluated through a much longer lens, not just immediate gain, but long-term continuity. When people think in generations rather than years, their behavior changes dramatically. Risk looks different, consumption looks different, investment looks different. Short-term excitement becomes less important. Stability becomes far more valuable. A luxury purchase that feels rewarding today may appear insignificant when compared to the opportunity to build long-term financial security. This perspective also encourages patience. Because generational wealth cannot be rushed, it grows slowly, often across decades of consistent decisions. Each generation contributes something. To education, capital, relationships, opportunities. Over time, these contributions accumulate, and what begins as modest stability can eventually grow into significant wealth. Historically, this mindset helped many Jewish families survive periods of economic uncertainty and political change. Throughout history, Jewish communities often faced displacement, restrictions, and sudden disruptions. Under such conditions, building wealth purely through physical assets could be risky. Land could be confiscated. Businesses could be restricted. Entire communities could be forced to relocate. But generational thinking provided resilience. Instead of relying on a single form of wealth, families focused on assets that could travel across borders and survive difficult times. Education, skills, professional networks, portable capital. These assets could be rebuilt even if circumstances changed. And when these assets were passed down through generations, they created long-term advantages. Children inherited not only financial resources, but also knowledge and expectations. They grew up understanding the importance of discipline, learning, and responsibility. In many ways, this cultural transmission became one of the most powerful forms of wealth, because habits and values often determine financial outcomes more than money itself. Personally, I find this principle fascinating because it challenges the way modern society often approaches success. Today's culture tends to emphasize speed, fast growth, quick profits, immediate results. But generational thinking operates at a completely different pace. It asks questions that extend far beyond individual ambition. What skills are we developing that will benefit future generations? What knowledge are we passing on? What financial systems are we creating? These questions require patience and humility, because the results may not fully appear during one lifetime. Instead, each generation becomes part of a longer story. One generation studies and builds knowledge. The next generation expands opportunity. Another generation protects and multiplies the wealth that came before. Over time, the family or community develops a powerful economic foundation. This idea also connects closely to education. When families value learning deeply, each generation begins life with more intellectual resources than the previous one. This intellectual compounding can become even more powerful than financial compounding. Skills improve, professional networks expand, business knowledge deepens, and financial literacy spreads throughout the family. Eventually, the family operates not just as individuals, but as a collective system of knowledge and opportunity. And this system can survive economic changes that might destroy isolated fortunes. But generational thinking also requires discipline, because it demands resisting certain temptations. The temptation to consume everything today, the temptation to prioritize status over stability, the temptation to chase short-term gains that could endanger long-term security. Families that think in generations often develop cultural norms that protect against these risks. They encourage modest living even during times of prosperity. They emphasize responsibility alongside opportunity. They teach younger generations that wealth carries obligations as well as privileges. This cultural reinforcement helps maintain stability over long periods. Without it, even large fortunes can disappear surprisingly quickly. History is full of examples of families that built enormous wealth only to lose it within 1 or 2 generations. Often, the reason was not economic collapse. It was the loss of discipline. When later generations inherit wealth without inheriting the values that created it, the system eventually breaks down. This is why generational wealth is not only about transferring money, it is about transferring mindset, work ethic, financial literacy, responsibility, patience. These qualities must accompany financial assets if wealth is to survive. And when families successfully pass down both resources and values, something remarkable happens. Wealth becomes stable, not just financially, but culturally. Each generation strengthens the system instead of weakening it. And over time, the family moves further and further away from financial vulnerability. But there is one final principle that quietly reinforces all the others. A principle that may seem surprisingly simple, yet it appears repeatedly in the habits of many financially stable families. True wealth is often quiet. It does not seek constant attention. It does not depend on visible status. Instead, it grows steadily in the background, protected by discipline, patience, and long-term thinking. And that idea leads us to the final principle. There is another subtle advantage to thinking in generations rather than years. It changes how people measure success. In modern culture, success is often measured through visible milestones: a higher salary, a bigger house, a faster car. These markers are easy to see, and because they are visible, They often become the primary signals people use to judge financial progress. But when a family begins thinking in generational terms, those signals become far less important. Instead, the focus shifts toward foundations. Education becomes more valuable than appearance. Financial literacy becomes more important than temporary income. Stability becomes more meaningful than short bursts of success. Because when your timeline stretches across decades, and the question is no longer, what can I afford today? The question becomes, what will still matter 30 or 40 years from now? This shift in perspective often produces surprisingly calm financial behavior. Families who think in generations rarely feel the need to prove their success through consumption. They are less concerned with comparison, less driven by trends, less tempted by financial shortcuts. Their attention remains fixed on building systems that continue working long after a single moment of success has passed. Another important effect of generational thinking is the way it encourages continuity. Children grow up observing how money is handled. They see the discipline behind investment decisions. They hear conversations about long-term planning. Gradually, financial wisdom becomes part of the family culture. And it is not taught through lectures alone, it is absorbed through everyday behavior. Over time, this creates a powerful advantage. Because when a new generation begins adulthood already understanding these principles, they start several steps ahead. Instead of learning financial discipline after costly mistakes, they inherit a framework that helps them avoid those mistakes in the first place. And this quiet transmission of mindset may be one of the most important reasons why some families manage to preserve wealth across generations. Not because they were lucky once, but because they continue repeating the same principles, decade after decade. Chapter 8. Quiet. Wealth is stronger than loud wealth. There is a curious pattern that appears again and again when you study people who build stable wealth over long periods of time. They are often far less visible than you might expect. They do not always live in the most extravagant homes. They are not always driving the newest luxury cars, and they rarely spend much time trying to prove how successful they are. In fact, many of the most financially secure individuals you will ever meet might appear surprisingly ordinary from the outside. This is something economists have observed for decades. Many households with the highest net worth actually live far below the level of consumption that their income would allow. Instead of maximizing lifestyle, they maximize stability. Instead of displaying wealth, they quietly accumulate it. And this behavior reflects a powerful financial philosophy that has appeared repeatedly in many cultures, including Jewish traditions. True wealth does not need constant visibility. It grows quietly, slowly, and often invisibly. In modern society, this idea can feel almost counterintuitive, because we live in an environment where financial success is frequently associated with public signals. Social media shows luxury travel. Advertising promotes premium lifestyles. Entertainment often celebrates extreme displays of wealth. These images create a powerful psychological pressure. People begin to associate financial success with what can be seen: the house, the car, the watch, the vacation. But these signals often reveal far less about financial stability than people imagine. In many cases, visible wealth is financed through debt. Large homes come with large mortgages. Luxury vehicles come with expensive monthly payments. High consumption lifestyles require continuous high income to maintain. If income slows down, the entire structure becomes fragile. Quiet wealth works differently. It prioritizes freedom over appearance. Instead of using money to impress others, it uses money to create options. Options to change careers. Options to take time off. Options to invest in opportunities that may appear years in the future. Options to support family members when unexpected challenges arise. These options may not be visible to the outside world, but they represent a far deeper form of security. And historically, many families that successfully preserved wealth across generations adopted this quieter approach. They avoided excessive attention, and they maintained modest lifestyles even when they could afford far more. They reinvested profits rather than spending them immediately. Over time, these habits produced powerful results. Assets continued to grow. Financial pressure remained low. Opportunities expanded. This quiet discipline also protected them from one of the most destructive forces in financial life: comparison. When people measure their success primarily by comparing themselves to others, spending often increases dramatically. Someone buys a larger house because a neighbor did. Someone upgrades a car because a colleague did. Someone spends more simply to maintain an image. But comparison creates an endless cycle. There will always be someone with a larger house, a more expensive car, a more extravagant lifestyle. And trying to keep up with that cycle rarely leads to financial peace. Quiet wealth breaks that cycle completely, because the focus shifts inward rather than outward. The question becomes, is my financial life becoming stronger over time? Instead of, do I appear more successful than others? Personally, I believe this shift in mindset is one of the most powerful changes a person can make in their relationship with money. When you stop trying to display wealth, something interesting happens. You start building it more effectively. You make decisions based on long-term outcomes rather than short-term impressions. You feel less pressure to chase trends. You feel less anxiety about comparison. And you gain something that visible wealth rarely provides: calm. Financial calm is an underrated form of prosperity. It is the ability to sleep well knowing that unexpected problems will not immediately create crisis. It is the ability to make decisions based on opportunity rather than fear. It is the confidence that your financial structure is stable. And stability is what allows wealth to endure across decades and generations. Many families who successfully pass wealth across generations understand this principle deeply. They teach younger members of the family that money should serve life, not dominate it. They encourage modest habits even when resources are abundant. They emphasize responsibility alongside opportunity, because they understand that the greatest threat to wealth is often not economic collapse. It is the slow erosion of discipline. When wealth becomes a symbol of status rather than a tool for stability, it often disappears surprisingly quickly. History contains countless examples of fortunes built in one generation and lost in the next. Often, the cause was not bad luck. It was the loss of restraint, the loss of patience, the loss of the values that originally created the wealth. Quiet wealth protects against this, because it encourages humility, it encourages discipline, and it reminds people that financial success is not something to display. It is something to protect, grow, and eventually pass forward. When wealth is treated this way, it becomes more than money. It becomes a foundation, a structure that supports families, education, opportunity, and long-term stability. And when you step back and look at the principles we have explored throughout this audiobook, a pattern begins to emerge. Education, value creation, ownership, community, risk management, generational thinking, quiet discipline. None of these ideas promise instant wealth, but together they create something far more powerful: a financial life that becomes stronger year after year. And that strength is what allows wealth to survive far beyond a single lifetime. Which brings us to the final reflection. Because after all the strategies, principles, and philosophies we have explored, one question remains: what is wealth really for? And answering that question may be the most important step of all: the kind of wealth that lasts. After exploring these principles, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Wealth, at its core, is rarely about a single decision. It is not about one perfect investment. It is not about one lucky opportunity, and it is certainly not about one moment of success. Real wealth is usually the result of consistent thinking repeated over long periods of time. Education, value creation, ownership, community, protecting capital, thinking in generations, living with quiet discipline. Each of these ideas may seem simple when viewed individually, but when they are practiced together over decades, they create something remarkably powerful. They create stability, and stability is often the true foundation of wealth. In many ways, what we have explored in this audiobook is not simply a financial strategy. No, it is a philosophy about how to live with money. A philosophy that appears repeatedly in Jewish traditions, but also appears in many other cultures that have successfully built long-term prosperity. The central idea behind this philosophy is surprisingly balanced. Money matters, but it should never dominate life. Money should support education. It should support opportunity. It should support family and community, but it should not replace purpose, values, or relationships. Personally, I find this perspective deeply refreshing in a world where financial conversations often become extreme. On one side, there are voices that treat money as the ultimate goal. Success is measured entirely through income, luxury, and visible status. On the other side, there are voices that dismiss money as unimportant, as if financial stability has no role in creating freedom or opportunity. But the philosophy we explored throughout this audiobook sits somewhere in the middle. Money is powerful, but it must remain a tool. When money becomes a tool, it can create remarkable things. It can fund education for future generations. It can provide security during uncertain times. It can give people the freedom to pursue meaningful work instead of desperate survival. And perhaps, most importantly, it can create the conditions for stability across generations. Because one of the most powerful ideas behind long-term wealth is that financial decisions rarely affect only one person. They affect families, children, grandchildren, and sometimes people we may never even meet. And a single decision to invest in education rather than luxury may shape the trajectory of a family for decades. A single decision to protect capital instead of chasing risky profit may preserve opportunities for future generations. These decisions often appear small in the moment, but time transforms small decisions into powerful outcomes. That is the quiet power of long-term thinking. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside many of the principles we explored. Wealth is rarely created through dramatic breakthroughs. It is created through disciplined behavior repeated year after year. The habits you build, the knowledge you pursue, the patience you practice. These factors compound just as powerfully as financial investments. Over time, they shape not only your bank account, but your entire relationship with money. And once that relationship becomes balanced, something interesting happens. Money stops being a source of constant stress. Instead, it becomes a system you understand, a system you manage calmly, a system that gradually becomes stronger, not overnight, but steadily. And when that stability appears, wealth begins to serve its most important purpose, not status, not comparison, but freedom. Freedom to make thoughtful decisions, freedom to support the people who matter most, freedom to build a life guided by values instead of financial pressure. And in the end, that kind of freedom may be the most valuable form of wealth anyone can achieve.